On the morning of the 20th of November, 1820, a whale turned around and came back. A Nantucket whale ship was sitting quietly in the empty Pacific when a sperm whale, a big one, lined itself up with the bow and charged. It struck once, hard enough to knock grown men off their feet. Then it backed off, lay still in the water, and did the thing no whale was supposed to do. It came again, faster, straight at the same spot.
I turned around and saw him about 100 rods directly ahead of us, coming down apparently with twice his ordinary speed. And to me at that moment, it appeared with tenfold fury and vengeance in his aspect.
That is the first mate of the ship, writing it down a year later. His name was Owen Chase. The ship was the Essex, and within minutes, she was on her side and sinking. 20 men scrambling into 3 small open boats in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth. Keep that boat in your mind. The most famous sea story ever written, Moby-Dick, is built on this exact wreck. And the very worst of what happened next, what these 20 men did to each other in those open boats, the author left out. You think you know this story. You don't. 30 years after that whale charged the Essex, a failed novelist who had once worked the same Pacific whaling grounds published a 600-page book about a sea captain hunting one particular whale. The book sold badly. The author died, nearly forgotten. And then, the 20th century dug it back up and decided it was the great American novel. Moby-Dick, the white whale, a symbol you were handed in school and told meant obsession. So here is the charge against the book, that it is a tall tale, a fish story, a man and a metaphor. And here is what the record actually shows. The whale was real. The shipwreck was real. The man who survived it wrote it all down, and his account reached Herman Melville himself, out on the open Pacific, close to the very spot where it happened. The book we file under fiction is the most honest kind of reporting there is. Let me put it back, in order. Start with the world, because the world is gone, and you need it to understand the stakes. In 1820, the most important energy company on Earth was a sandy little island off Massachusetts called Nantucket. 7,000 people, almost no soil, and a near monopoly on a global hunt for the sperm whale. Because inside the head of a sperm whale is a reservoir of the finest oil in the world. It burned brighter and cleaner than anything else, and it lubricated the machines of the early industrial age. Whale oil lit the cities. This was the petroleum of its day, and Nantucket was the Gulf. By the museum's count, the island had a fleet of dozens of whale ships scattered across 2 oceans. And the way you got that oil was insane. You sailed a wooden ship halfway around the planet, and then, when you found whales, you did not fight them from the ship. You lowered even smaller boats, open cedar boats, maybe 25 feet, and you rowed up to an animal the size of the ship and put a harpoon into it by hand. If it ran, it towed you across the sea at the end of a rope. Whalemen called it a Nantucket sleigh ride. If it turned, it could bite your boat in half or smash it with its flukes. And the richest hunting was now thousands of miles out, in a remote patch of the Pacific they called the offshore ground, which meant that out there, a wrecked ship was not an emergency. It was a death sentence with a long delay. The Essex was an old ship, small, around 238 tons, but lucky, with years of safe, profitable voyages behind her. She sailed from Nantucket on the 12th of August, 1819, under a first-time captain named George Pollard, with Owen Chase as first mate and Matthew Joy as second. She left with 21 men aboard. One of them deserted at a port in South America, so by the day everything happened, there were 20. Among them, a 14-year-old cabin boy named Thomas Nickerson, who would live a very long time and, half a century later, write his own account of what he saw, which is how we have 2 witnesses to this, not one. More than a year out, far in the offshore ground, the boats were down chasing a pod when Chase, back aboard the ship doing repairs, noticed a single very large whale lying still off the bow.
A very large spermaceti whale, as well as I could judge, about 85 feet in length.
85 feet. I want to be honest with you about that number, because it matters. That is Chase's eyeball estimate in a moment of terror, as well as I could judge, and it is larger than any sperm whale we can reliably measure today. But it isn't a fish story lie. A jawbone in a whaling museum scales up to an animal nearly that big, and historians like Nathaniel Philbrick think the largest old bulls really were that size before a century of hunting killed them off. So, enormous, incredibly so, it came at the ship.
He came down upon us with full speed and struck the ship with his head just forward of the forechains.
That was the first blow. The ship shuddered. The whale passed underneath, surfaced, and lay there working its jaws. And then it turned and made its second deliberate run, the one Chase could never explain as an accident, and drove its forehead into the bow at speed. The timbers stove in, the sea came in. Now, was it revenge? Chase thought so. He wrote that it seemed like vengeance. But that is a sailor's reading of an animal, not science. The men had just been harpooning that whale's pod. The likeliest truth is that a wounded, provoked bull did what a wounded, provoked bull will do. The whale's mind we cannot know. The hole in the ship is a fact. So picture it. 20 men, 3 small boats, a few barrels of hardtack and fresh water, and Chase's own words for their situation.
More than 1,000 miles from the nearest land.
And here is the decision that turned a shipwreck into a horror. The nearest land was a cluster of islands to the west, the Marquesas, the Society Islands, only about a fortnight's sail downwind. They chose not to go there. They turned the other way, toward South America, a brutal beat against the wind of some 2,000 miles. Why? Because they had heard the islands were full of cannibals.
These islands we were entirely ignorant of. If inhabited, we presumed they were by savages, from whom we had as much to fear as from the elements, or even death itself.
Hold that sentence, because it is the cruelest irony in the whole record. The fear was wrong. Traders were visiting those islands at the time without being eaten. And the choice they made out of fear of cannibals is the exact choice that would 3 months later force these men to become cannibals themselves. Captain Pollard, for what it's worth, leaned toward the islands. His first mate and the crew argued for the long route to South America, and that is the way they went. What happened in those boats over the next 90-some days is one of the hardest things in American history to tell, and I am going to tell it plainly and without relish, because the people it happened to deserve that. The men starved. They drank seawater and went mad from it. They cooked strips of fish on the hot wooden seats. Second mate Matthew Joy was the first to die in January, and his body was wrapped and given to the sea. Then men kept dying, and the living, with nothing left, began to eat the dead. And here's a fact the record states flatly, and we should not look away from. The first 4 men to die and be eaten were all black sailors. On a whale ship, the black crew got the worst of everything. The meanest rations, the hardest berths. And so out there, they weakened and died first. It is not a coincidence. It is the structure of that world followed to its end. And then, in the captain's boat, they ran out even of the dead. 4 men were left. Captain Pollard, his teenage cousin, 18-year-old Owen Coffin, whom Pollard had personally promised to look after, a young man named Charles Ramsdell, and a 4th, Barzillai Ray. With no food and no bodies left, the men fell back on the oldest, grimmest law of the sea. They would draw lots. One man would die so the others could live. Pollard tried to stop it. By his own account, when the lot fell to Owen Coffin, the captain offered to take the boy's place, or to shoot anyone who came near him.
My lad, if you don't like your lot, I'll shoot the first man that touches you.
The boy refused.
I like it as well as any other.
A second lot was drawn to decide who would do it. It fell to Ramsdell, Coffin's own friend. And he did it. I'll say clearly, these words come to us from Pollard's own retelling years later, not a transcript. But Pollard carried that boat to his grave, and when an interviewer pressed him on it once, he stopped.
But I can tell you no more. My head is on fire at the recollection. I hardly know what I say.
Rescue, when it came, was almost accidental. On the 18th of February 1821, after roughly 3 months at sea, an English ship found Chase's boat. 5 days later, a Nantucket whaler found pollards. The two survivors so far gone they were clutching the bones of their dead and could not at first understand they were saved. 3 more men had chosen weeks earlier to take their chances on a barren little island the crew thought was called Ducie. It was actually Henderson Island, and astonishingly, they were rescued too in April. Of the 20 men who climbed into those boats, 8 came home. That is the true story of the whale that sank a ship. Now watch what a writer does with it. Because the white whale everyone remembers? It was real, and it was not the whale that sank this ship. Owen Chase got home in the summer of 1821, and within months published his account. Narrative of the most extraordinary and distressing shipwreck of the whale ship Essex. A thin book, written up with the help of a hired pen, and for years almost the only record of what happened. And 20 years later, that thin book found the one reader who would matter. In 1841, a young sailor named Herman Melville was working a whaler called the Acushnet in the same Pacific. Out there, ships meeting at sea would stop and visit, a gam. And on one of those visits, Melville met a teenage boy who turned out to be Owen Chase's own son. The boy went to his sea chest and handed Melville a copy of his father's narrative. Melville read the whole thing right there, on the water, near the very spot where the Essex went down.
The reading of this wondrous story upon the landless sea, and close to the very latitude of the shipwreck, had a surprising effect upon me.
Now I have to be careful here, because this is where the legend wants to take over, and the truth is more interesting than the legend. Melville did not simply novelize the Essex. He built his whale out of 3 different things, and you have to keep them apart. The first is the Essex itself. That gave him the ending, the unthinkable image of a whale deliberately destroying a ship. The second is the science. For everything the book knows about actual whales, Melville leaned on a naturalist named Thomas Beale and his Natural History of the Sperm Whale. The Essex gave him the catastrophe, Beale gave him the facts. And the third thing is the color. Because the whale that sank the Essex was never described as white, the whiteness comes from a completely separate animal, a real one, this time wrapped in legend. In 1839, the explorer Jeremiah Reynolds published a piece in the Knickerbocker magazine about a notorious, much-scarred old bull sperm whale that haunted the waters off Mocha Island, off Chile. The whalers had a name for him.
An old bull whale of prodigious size and strength. He was white as wool.
His name was Mocha-Dick. But that single magazine article, written to thrill, is most of what we have. The tale of 20 harpoons in his hide and 100 battles is sailor legend, not a logbook. So here are your 3 whales, and you must never let them touch. The Essex whale, real, dark, the size and the fury, the thing that actually sank a ship. Mocha-Dick, reportedly white, half legend, off Chile. And Moby-Dick, Melville's invention, who took the ending from one and the color from the other. Did the name Moby come from Mocha? Almost certainly the idea did. But Melville never once names Mocha-Dick in the book, and he never explained the spelling. That last little jump, from Mocha to Moby, is a thing scholars believe, not a thing Melville wrote down. So Melville takes the true story and writes his masterpiece. And here is the inversion at the heart of it. Moby-Dick ends where the real horror began. The novel builds for 600 pages to the whale destroying the ship, and then it stops. The Pequod goes down, and it's over. But for the real men of the Essex, the whale destroying the ship was day 1. Everything that actually broke a human being, the boats, the thirst, the lots, the bodies, all of that came after the part Melville chose to end on. He took the most unbearable true story he knew, and he kept only the opening. And then the book itself was nearly destroyed, in a way you would not believe if a novelist wrote it. Moby-Dick came out in 2 editions in 1851. In London, the publisher printed it as The Whale, and somehow, the British edition came out missing its final page. The epilogue, the short passage where the narrator Ishmael explains that he alone survived, floating on a coffin plucked from the sea.
and I only am escaped alone to tell thee.
Why was it cut? We genuinely do not know. No one has ever found the reason, but the effect was a disaster. British reviewers opened a book narrated in the first person by a man who, as far as their copy showed, had drowned along with everyone else. There was no one left alive to be telling the story. And here is the cruel part. Scholars connect this to the missing page. Reviewers, like the London Spectator, had laid down a rule that a novel shouldn't contain things its narrator could not possibly have survived to tell. And without the epilogue, the British copy had no surviving narrator at all. The reviewers savaged the book for a hole that the publisher had cut. They convicted Melville of a crime committed by a missing page. And the savaging was real. The London Athenaeum called it
so much trash belonging to the worst school of bedlam literature.
Now, one honest correction, because this channel does not deal in tidy myths. Moby-Dick was not universally panned. That's the easy version. The reviews were genuinely mixed. Some called it extraordinary, full of power and originality. The real failure was simpler and quieter. Almost nobody bought it. Across his whole life, the book sold fewer than about 4,000 copies. Melville earned, by one accounting, around $550 from it across his whole life. The first American printing never sold out, and then, 2 years later, a fire at his publisher's warehouse burned up most of what was left. The book, built on a shipwreck, became one, and much of what survived was burned. Melville lived another 40 years and watched his own reputation disappear. He stopped being able to sell novels. For 19 years, from 1866 to 1885, the man who wrote Moby-Dick worked as a customs inspector on the docks of New York, checking cargo for a living. When he died in 1891, the notices were tiny. One of them couldn't even get the title right. It called his masterpiece Moby-Dick, misspelled. And then, slowly, the thing turned around. Around the centenary of his birth in the 1920s, a few scholars went looking for Herman Melville and found a masterpiece nobody had read. One of them, Raymond Weaver, wrote the first real biography in 1921 and, digging through Melville's papers, found an unpublished manuscript in a drawer. It was Billy Budd. The book that sank had not, after all, gone all the way down. As for the men of the Essex, Owen Chase carried his nerves the rest of his life. And Captain George Pollard, who lost not only the Essex but a second whale ship a few years later, came home to Nantucket and lived out his days quietly as the town's night watchman. Melville, who met the old captain decades later on the one visit he ever made to Nantucket after the novel was already written, never forgot him.
To the islanders, he was a nobody. To me, the most impressive man, though wholly unassuming, even humble, that I ever encountered.
Pollard's nephew said that once a year, on the anniversary of the wreck, the old man locked his door and ate nothing. A private fast for his lost crew, including the boy he had promised to protect. In 2011, divers from a federal team found the wreck of Pollard's second lost ship on a Pacific reef. The tripods, the anchor, still down there in the dark. The sea keeps these things. So go back to where we started, to the morning the whale turned around and came back. We put Moby-Dick in the dock as a fish story, a man and a white whale and a great big symbol. But the ship was real, and so was the whale that sank it. The survivor's own account sat on Melville's desk. The cannibalism in the boats was real, and the only thing Melville did with it was decide it was too terrible to write down. The white whale was never the lie. The lie is that any of it was made up. The real whale was never white. The legend was. And the book we filed under fiction turns out to be the most honest kind of document there is. The truth, told slant, by a man who had read the testimony at sea, close to the very latitude of the shipwreck. Not guilty. The witness was telling the truth the whole time. We just stopped listening.